welcome to this explainer. Okay, I want you to imagine, just for a second, a world completely stripped of the color blue. Like, entirely gone. Seriously, think about it. If you erase blue from existence, you're not just losing the sky or the ocean. You instantly lose purple. You completely lose green. Every single shade of lilac, lavender, turquoise, and lime just vanishes. So what are you left with? Basically, just a flat, kind of boring landscape of reds, yellows, and oranges. It feels broken, right? Well, just like blue is this absolute fundamental building block of our visual world, the African continent is the hidden, bedrock ingredient of American arts and culture. It is literally impossible to envision the full spectrum of American art, food, or music without acknowledging the immense, underlying influence of Africa. It's the blue in our cultural palette. To really wrap our heads around this, let's anchor ourselves geographically. Today, we see modern borders and nations, places like Senegal, Ghana, and Nigeria. But historically, this West African region was a massive tapestry of powerful empires and ethnic groups. And because of the transatlantic slave trade from the 15th to the 19th centuries, this specific region is where the United States has its absolute deepest historical and cultural ties. Millions of enslaved people brought their traditions from these lands, and that forever changed the American landscape. Okay, let's dive into our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to look at America's soul in food, America's heartbeat in music, and America's conscience in literature. So, kicking things off with Pillar 1, America's soul, focusing on food and agriculture. Now, when we think of early American agricultural wealth, we usually just assume it was, well, originally American. But back in the 18th century, European settlers in South Carolina were actually failing miserably to cultivate Carolina gold rice in that swampy climate. They only succeeded and generated immense wealth for the early American South because they purposefully trafficked enslaved West Africans from what was known as the Rice Coast. These folks weren't just laborers, they were highly skilled agricultural experts. The African women brought over this incredibly specific toe-heel planting method, literally using their toes to create holes for the seeds and their heels to cover them up with soil. This African ingenuity absolutely salvaged and built an economic empire. But it wasn't just agricultural knowledge that made the journey. It was the actual physical crops. We have these incredible, truly heartbreaking yet brilliant historical accounts of African women and girls braiding the seeds of indigenous crops tightly into their hair before being forced onto slave ships. They did this so they could grow their foods from home wherever they ended up. And through this profound act of survival and preservation, crops that we all know today, like black-eyed peas, okra, and sweet watermelon, became completely foundational to American agriculture. Just consider okra for a second. You simply cannot talk about this highly nutritious crop without talking about Africa. Originating in tropical West Africa, it grew incredibly well in the American South, and it was frequently cultivated in the sustenance gardens of enslaved people, really just as a way to keep their families fed and healthy. Now, what's really interesting about this is how that raw African seed evolved into beloved, iconic American comfort food. That okra was transformed into the thick, savory stews we now know as gumbo. And when you pair it with rice and a stew of tomatoes and peppers, it's actually the direct ancestor to jambalaya. These are traditional West African flavor profiles, brilliantly preserved through generations. And the influence goes way beyond just specific crops. It bleeds into the very techniques we consider uniquely American. Think about deep frying fish or having a classic American barbecue in the backyard. Historical records show that both of these cooking styles, deep frying and grilling meats over open fires, actually date all the way back to 15th century traditional West African cooking methods. When enslaved chefs prepared meals for Southern plantation owners, they permanently stamped these African techniques right into the American culinary DNA. Moving right along to Pillar 2, America's heartbeat, where we'll look at music and dance. So transitioning from the plate to the stage, Africa provided the literal rhythm of American music. The absolute core of this heartbeat is the polyrhythm. This is when you have multiple independent rhythms playing simultaneously to create a layered, complex sound. Symbolically, this reflects the traditional African cultural value of collectivism, many different voices working together as one cohesive unit. Musically, it laid the absolute groundwork for jazz, funk, hip-hop, pop, and even heavy metal. Without African polyrhythms, modern American music would honestly just be flat and linear. And this brilliantly illustrates the lineage we're talking about. What you're seeing on the left is the West African akonting. It's made from a hollowed gourd, has a long neck, and very specific string placements. And on the right is an early American banjo. The banjo, an instrument that is so deeply tied to Americana and folk music, was actually created by enslaved West Africans in America, maintaining the exact playing style and design of their ancestral home. It's an incredible direct link. Another massive musical contribution is call and response. This is a pattern where a caller initiates a rhythm or a phrase, and the audience immediately answers back. In West African performance culture, this isn't just for entertainment, though. It's a vital tool. It's designed to blur the lines between the performer and the crowd, gathering morale, unifying the community's identity, and really helping groups endure grueling, backbreaking labor. And you might be completely surprised where this African tradition shows up today. Take square dancing. That characteristic caller shouting out the moves, that whole tradition actually originated from enslaved black fiddlers performing for white partygoers. They adapted their ancestral call and response, and white dancers kept it going long after. Today, this lives on everywhere, from James Brown to modern hip-hop tracks, all the way to line dances like the Cupid Shuffle that you hear at literally every modern wedding. And of course, you can't have music without movement. Breakdancing is a perfect modern demonstration of something called body isolation. That's moving your shoulders to one rhythm while your hips or your feet move to a completely different one. This, along with percussive stepping and angular body movements, is a hallmark of traditional African dance. Enslaved people kept these physical traditions alive through stomping and shuffling when traditional drumming was strictly banned by slaveholders. Eventually, these isolated movements evolved into American tap dance, the high-flying Lindy Hop of the swing era, and the modern breakdancing we see on the streets today. Let's hit our final section, Pillar 3, America's Conscience, looking at literature. The African oral tradition fundamentally shaped the storytelling framework of American literature. We can trace a pretty clear chronological evolution here. Because reading and writing were strictly forbidden for enslaved people, they relied heavily on storytelling. But these folktales were highly functional. They were actually used to secretly pass along encoded messages about planned escapes and rendezvous points. Over time, this powerful tradition of spoken resilience evolved into published slave narratives and eventually blossomed into the massive artistic boom of the Harlem Renaissance. A huge part of this oral tradition was the trickster motif. In West African folktales, characters like the African hare were used to show how smaller, weaker animals could use their sharp wit and intelligence to completely outsmart larger, menacing predators. In America, that African hare adapted to become the famous Brer Rabbit. And you have to understand, these weren't just cute children's stories. They were profound symbols of Black Americans yearning for freedom, subversion, and self-determination against the crushing weight of the people who enslaved them. As some enslaved people managed to escape to the North, that fierce oral tradition gave birth to the written slave narrative. Because many still couldn't read or write, authors would often dictate their incredible, harrowing memories with vivid emotional detail to someone who could physically write it down for them. These 19th century books became a literal revolutionary weapon. They forced Americans and Europeans to look the brutal reality of slavery right in the eye, becoming absolute core texts that fueled the abolitionist efforts. They also served as an absolutely crucial reality check for the whole nation. While a lot of white Southern writers were busy publishing romanticized, revisionist fiction about how peaceful and happy plantation life supposedly was, the first-hand slave narratives preserved the grim, undeniable truth. This vital injection of authentic truth-telling basically became the conscience of American literature. It set a standard of realism that directly inspired the later works of literary giants like Harriet Beecher Stowe and Mark Twain. So the crucial point we're making here is beautifully summarized by this thought. African influence does not always show up in forms with which our minds make obvious connections. We love to call America a melting pot, right? But the flavors in a melting pot don't just vanish into some bland, tasteless porridge. They enhance and elevate everything. Africa is that profound, vital, underlying flavor in the entire American recipe. Which brings us right back to where we started. Remember our world without the color blue? Well, once you realize that the banjo, the backyard barbecue, breakdancing, and the blues themselves all trace back to West Africa, the world is completely recolored. The blue is everywhere. And once you learn to see the vibrant African influence woven into the very fabric of American arts and culture, you can never, ever unsee it. So I leave you with this final question to think about. Where will you spot these hidden roots the next time you sit down to eat a meal, listen to a song, or read a classic book? The history is right there, just waiting for you to find it. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring.